They said the caves of Shenandoah were silent, but silence in those winters of 1863 was never empty. Lanterns flickered beneath the ridgelines where men hid from the cold and the cannon fire. What they found there was not safety, but something watching. The Union patrol had gone missing for 3 nights. By the 4th, a single soldier crawled back to camp, his face covered in soot, his voice gone. All he could whisper was that the walls had moved. The surgeon wrote in his log, "Pupils dilated, pulse erratic. Reports of movement underground. Claims to have seen figures without eyes." The entry ends with a single line underlined twice, "Cavern presence confirmed." That fragment still exists in the regimental archives, smudged with what looks like candle wax and ash. No one knows why he survived when the others did not. But the next patrol sent to retrieve the bodies reported something stranger. Still their boots echoed inside the tunnels, and then stopped halfway through as if the rock itself swallowed the sound. A Confederate observer, hidden on the opposite ridge, noted light within the valley, like fireflies seen moving beneath the ground. The report was dismissed as imagination, another soldier's madness from hunger and cold. But when miners reopened the same cave decades later, they found rusted belt buckles, scraps of blue wool, and lantern glass fused into the stone as if by extreme heat. No record explains why a cave deep in limestone would bear signs of fire. In Shenandoah, they still tell stories of that winter patrol. Men who went underground to escape the war above and never came back the same. The locals call them the dwellers, the ones who listened too long to the earth's breathing. Some say, on quiet nights, the valley still exhales, and if you stand near the old sinkholes, you can hear them whispering back. What began as a simple act of survival became something else. A story buried between report and rumor, between war and what watches war unfold in the dark. And tonight we're reopening that file, The Cave Dwellers of Shenandoah, 1863. This version immerses you deeper into Shenandoah winter, 1863. The geography, the soldiers' psychological state, the cave networks, and the whispered presence beneath them. It was the winter that refused to end. Shenandoah lay buried under a pale shroud of snow, its hills breathing frost like old lungs. The trees stood stripped bare black veins against the sky. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp gunpowder, and something faintly metallic like rusted blood thawing in the wind. By December 1863, the valley had become a scar between armies. Union forces pressed south along the river. Confederate skirmishers vanished into the folds of the mountains. Between them stretched no man's land, frozen orchards, burned farmhouses, silent roads. A place where men disappeared as easily as footprints in snow. Shenandoah had always been beautiful and cruel. Before the war, it was a patchwork of wheat fields and apple groves, gentle rivers winding through limestone ridges. But war changed its voice. Locals said the earth had grown tired of hearing cannon fire. They swore the ground trembled differently now, as if remembering too much. Refugees from the lower valley took shelter wherever they could. Some in root cellars, others in hollow barns. And some, those with nowhere left to go, found the caves. Hidden in the folds of the Blue Ridge, the limestone openings were older than memory. Cool in the summer, dry in the cold. They were sanctuaries once, for animals, for travelers, for runaway slaves seeking the cover of the underground. Now, they became the last refuge of soldiers who had run out of light. Union patrols from the 12th Corps began using them after the Battle of New Market Gap. At first only to store supplies, powder, salt, pork, whiskey. Then to hide from Confederate scouts who knew the valley too well. The entrances were easy to miss, half swallowed by vines and frost. But the deeper you went, the quieter the world became. Sound dissolved. Footsteps softened. The air turned heavy still. The men joked that they could hear the mountain breathe. At night their lanterns drew pale halos on the rock amber light swallowed by stone. Letters written from that winter mention the sound of water that isn't water, and voices in the echo that repeat words we didn't say. One corporal described it as a strange resonance, like the cave wants to answer you. Most dismissed it as nerves. The men were exhausted, frostbitten, starving. Some hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. The rations froze solid by dawn. Their coffee turned to ice before it could steam. When the wind screamed down from Massanutten Mountain, they could feel it pulse through the ground like a drum. But there were other sounds too soft, irregular, like movement against rock. They said it came from the deeper tunnels, the ones no one mapped. The Shenandoah cave systems stretch for miles. Some linked by ancient underground rivers, others splitting into dead ends that collapse without warning. Miners in later decades found entire chambers sealed by centuries of mud. The air inside perfectly still untouched since before the war. Back in 1863, the soldiers didn't know that. They only knew the dark was thick enough to taste. Sergeant Henry Latham kept a small journal. In it, he wrote, "This cavern seems endless. We've marked the walls with chalk to find our way back. But the marks fade faster than they should." One of the men swore he saw a reflection of our own fire deeper in, though no one had gone that far. The next line is blurred, smudged by damp or sweat. Only the last words remain clear. I heard breathing where no one stood. Military paperwork from that week confirms that 3 men under Latham's command went missing. No trace, no fight, no report of desertion. The official note reads, "Presumed lost in cave collapse," but there's no record of a collapse anywhere in the valley that month. Outside, the war continued, as if nothing had happened. The Army of the Potomac moved north. The Confederates regrouped across the ridges. By the time word spread, the snow had buried the trail. The entrances iced over, leaving only thin slivers of darkness between icicles like teeth. No one went back in. Local farmers who later inspected the site said their mules refused to approach the opening. One man claimed the air near it hummed like the distant vibration of a tuning fork. Another described a low whisper that grew louder when he pressed his ear to the ground. He was laughed at in town, until his son went missing near the same slope 2 years later. Old folklore in Shenandoah had warned of the hollerers' spirits that lived in the earth, mimicking voices to lure travelers into the hills. Most dismissed those as mountain tales told to frighten children. But as the war dragged on and more soldiers disappeared without trace, the line between story and history began to blur. Every campfire carried the same question: how deep do the caves go? Cartographers tried to chart them in the 1870s. Their early maps show patterns that spiral, not straight loops that begin and end in the same spot. One note scribbled in the corner of a surviving draft reads, "Echoes persist longer than sound." No wind, no known current. No one ever finished the survey. To this day, the limestone beneath Shenandoah remains riddled with unseen corridors. Locals say that when the air is right, you can feel the cold rise from under the ground like a sigh. Historians treat it as geology. But the valley's people still leave offerings near certain sinkholes: coins, feathers, scraps of cloth, small gestures for whatever listens below. The soldiers who hid in those caves weren't searching for ghosts. They were searching for warmth, for quiet, for a night without gunfire. But the quiet they found wasn't peace. It was a stillness that watched them back, the kind of silence that learns your breath, then waits for it to stop. As winter dragged on, more patrols were sent, fewer returned. And somewhere between the frozen riverbanks and the sleeping mountains, the caves of Shenandoah became more than a refuge. They became a threshold between the living world above and something ancient beneath it. No one at headquarters could explain the missing men. Their names faded from rosters. Their letters stopped mid-sentence. And by spring, the valley melted into mud and legend. But some fragments survived in the archives in whispered recollections, in the way every local still lowers their voice when talking about the winter of '63. Shenandoah never forgot. And sometimes when the fog creeps low over the river and the hills disappear into cloud, it feels like the land is still hiding them. Those soldiers who went underground to escape the war above and found something waiting that no war ever named. The first record appears in the winter dispatches of the Union Army's 12th Corps, dated December 29, 1863. Reconnaissance detail assigned to lower Shenandoah Valley status incomplete. Missing personnel 4. There's no elaboration, no mention of caves, just a cold phrase typed on brittle paper. But tucked beneath that report, there's a handwritten note, barely legible ink faded to brown. Tunnels extend farther than expected. Strange drafts, no echo response. It isn't signed. Weeks later, another file emerges, this time from the field hospital near Front Royal. Dr. Elijah Carter, surgeon, U.S. Volunteers. His handwriting is clean, deliberate, methodical. He writes of a soldier named Private Reuben Lake, discovered alone approximately half a mile from bivouac. Exhibits disorientation, tremors, severe dehydration. Claims to have been pursued within the caves by figures resembling his comrades. Eyes unresponsive to light. Pupils wide and fixed. He notes that the patient's heartbeat was irregular, his skin unusually cold. Carter's last line reads, "Will not sleep," insists he can still hear them moving in the dark. 2 days later, Private Lake is listed as deceased. Cause of death: exposure and shock. But the autopsy line, where Carter should have written his observations, is blank. Instead, a single smudge trails across the page as though someone dragged a finger through wet ink. The next record comes from the quartermaster's department. A supply manifest for lanterns oil and spare boots issued to Company D for cave survey, January 4, 1864. No report of return. In the margin, faint pencil marks. Only 2 came back. The clerk's signature is missing. Later that spring, after the thaw, an order from headquarters demanded the caves be sealed. Official reason: structural instability and potential for cave-ins. But the order number doesn't match the usual series used for engineering directives. It matches the sequence reserved for quarantine sites. The Shenandoah Archives hold fragments from letters written by soldiers around that time, letters never sent. One from Corporal Ezra Pike to his wife. The men grow uneasy here. The earth hums when we lay still. At night we hear boots on the gravel, but they do not match the number of men in camp. Sometimes we answer the roll call and find the echo replies before we do. The letter ends abruptly. No signature. Another, from an anonymous officer, filed under unverified lantern light, behaves strangely underground, flickers without draft. Men report seeing shapes moving between the reflections of the flame. Private Dawson insists he saw his own shadow separate from his body. I cannot confirm, but morale declines. The official press never published these accounts. The Valley campaign was too chaotic, too fragmented. Reports vanished in the churn of war. Files lost to fire, to rain, to the indifference of bureaucracy. But some papers survived by accident, stored in trunks, sealed in attics, rediscovered by archivists decades later, brittle as moth wings. In 1937, a Works Progress Administration historian named John Wexler cataloged oral histories from the Shenandoah region. One farmer recalled his grandfather serving in that same valley in 1863. The old man had described a cave full of bluecoats who came out changed. When Wexler asked what he meant, the farmer said, "They weren't sick. They weren't wounded. But when they walked, it sounded like they were hollow inside." Another local tale recorded in the same collection speaks of soldiers seen wandering near the riverbank long after the fighting ended, uniforms black with soot eyes, clouded white vanishing when approached. Wexler wrote in his notebook, stories repeated with consistency across counties. Patterns align with missing unit rosters. Locals fear the caves. Call them the Hollow Barracks. But the most chilling fragment isn't in folklore. It's in an engineering survey dated 1872, conducted by a team studying potential mining routes. The foreman's report lists old military debris found deep within an uncharted cavern, fragments of Union buttons, a rusted bayonet, and a glass vial still half full of thick amber fluid. Next to it, a sketch of a small rough carving in stone. The image shows a human face, but the eyes are shallow depressions, smooth and hollow. Beneath it, a single word scratched in shaky letters, "Listen." The surveyor's notes end 2 pages later. No conclusion, no coordinates, just a final sentence. The air grew colder the deeper we went, though the draft ceased entirely. Historians who reviewed these documents often dismissed them as the paranoia of a war-torn age. Men lost in the dark mines, unraveling from exhaustion. They blamed lack of oxygen, hallucinations, cave acoustics, isolation. All reasonable explanations. Yet none account for what was found a century later. In 1964, a team from the Virginia Speleological Society reopened one of the sealed entrances near the old Fisher's Hill battlefield. Their expedition log is calm at first measurements, sketches sediment notes. Then halfway through the handwriting shifts. One line underlined twice, found residual heat marks along ceiling unusual pattern. Appears artificial. No evidence of torch soot. They withdrew after 2 hours. Equipment failure, they claimed. But the lead researcher, Dr. Helen Ward, refused to speak publicly about the trip again. Her private journal, found after her death in 1981, contains one strange entry dated that same night. "We heard breathing, but we were alone." The Army Archives in Washington still list the 12th Corps reconnaissance of Shenandoah as inconclusive. No one was ever charged with falsifying records. No memorial marks their absence. Only a note in a forgotten ledger buried in the microfilm reels. 4 men, missing beneath the ridge, presumed lost, unrecovered. Fact ends there. Or so it seems. Because every so often, deep in the stacks of the National Archives, another historian finds something, a receipt for lantern oil. A mislabeled field sketch, a name repeated where it shouldn't be. Small echoes, faint traces. As if the story itself keeps surfacing, refusing to stay buried. And somewhere beneath the limestone, the valley still hums when the wind passes through. Old miners say it's the air pressure. Locals say it's the men who never came back. The documents don't decide. They only leave us with the same unanswerable whisper that perhaps not everything beneath the battlefield was made of stone. They say the war ended on paper, but not in Shenandoah. The guns fell silent, the flags came down, and yet the valley never truly rested. People rebuilt their barns, sowed their fields again, but the soil was never the same. Plows struck metal instead of rock, unearthing buttons, bullets bone. And when the thaw came each spring, water streamed down from the ridges carrying small things, belt clasps, dented flasks, once even a jawbone still bearing a tooth of gold. But it wasn't the relics that frightened them. It was what came with them. The air that hung too still, the faint hum beneath the ground that no one wanted to talk about. In the first years after the war, when the valley was quiet and hollow, farmers began noticing places where their horses refused to step. The animals would circle trembling, as if the earth itself were pulsing under their hooves. Men digging wells there found the ground hollow, struck with a dull echo, as though the soil was only a thin shell stretched over something deeper. Some swore they heard dripping water, others something like slow breathing. They called it the breathing ground. They said it belonged to the war, that the valley had lungs now swollen with everything it had seen. Stories spread quickly in small towns. Every family had a tale. A boy who went to chase fireflies near Fisher's Hill and came back pale, muttering that the lights had followed him underground. A woman who swore she heard hammering beneath her root cellar, though her husband had been dead 3 winters. An old hunter who claimed he met a man in blue uniform wandering the forest, asking for the way to a camp that no longer existed. When the hunter turned to point, the man was gone, but the footprints remained, leading straight into a patch of bare stone where no footprints should hold. By the 1870s, people had stopped using the word haunted. They said it too often. It lost its shape. Instead, they spoke of echoes, not ghosts, not souls, just remnants. Echoes of the war itself moving beneath the valley, repeating what men had shouted into the smoke and dirt. The caves became places no one entered willingly. Children dared one another to toss pebbles inside, listening for how long it took to hit the bottom. Sometimes there was no sound at all. Old letters from that time mention a traveling preacher named Amos Tillman, a thin man with a voice that carried like thunder across wooden barns. He rode from town to town, warning that the war had opened a door where men and memory trade places. Tillman said he'd been shown a vision, a cavern filled with men still standing. Eyes turned, white faces, blank as limestone, the living carved into stone by the sin of remembrance. He called them the Hallowed. In some versions of his sermon, they were the soldiers who had taken shelter in the caves and never came out. In others, they were the voices of the mountain itself, trying to mimic the living. Tillman's followers gathered at night, singing hymns in the fog, leaving candles burning at cave mouths, so the souls could find their way upward. But sometimes the candles burned in reverse wax, melting upward flame, bending inward. When that happened, they said the Hallowed had listened and chosen to stay. By the turn of the century, the valley's folklore had become layered, tangled between fact and faith. Children born decades after the war still whispered of the eyeless men. Farm hands refused to work near the sinkholes that gaped open after heavy rain. Miners mapping new tunnels in 1898 unearthed what looked like campfire glass fused into the stone, smooth as melted amber. They found no charcoal, no sign of flame, but the rock glistened with something black and oily that hardened when touched. The foreman wrote in his ledger, "Subterranean burn, origin unknown." He quit 3 days later, saying the walls made noise when his lantern went out. Locals told the story differently. They said the miners had disturbed a sleeping vein, an ancient artery of the earth where the dwellers rested. They said the dark bled when cut. No one went down again. When electricity came to the valley, the stories adapted. Lights would flicker near the hills. Radios crackled with faint Morse patterns no operator could trace. In 1911, a reporter for the Staunton Sentinel described strange failures in the telegraph lines running through Shenandoah during heavy fog. Messages came scrambled with repeated words, beneath, beneath, beneath. He dismissed it as static from moisture. But at the end of his article, he included a quote from a lineman who had worked that night, as there was no thunder, no lightning. The air was clear. Yet the wires hummed like someone was talking through the ground. By the 1920s, the name the Dwellers had replaced the older Hallowed. Children played games, daring each other to call out to them 3 times, standing on the edge of the breathing ground. If you shouted, the story went something deep below, would whisper your name back, but wrong, like hearing yourself from inside a well. Some said the echo called twice. The second time, it used your voice. A WPA folklore collector in 1933 recorded dozens of such stories. They came from farmers, widows, miners, and one old Confederate veteran living near Woodstock. He told the collector the bluecoats were never found because they kept walking. Not forward, not backward, just down. The mountain takes its own prisoners. Some nights I still hear the drums under the floorboards. When the collector asked him what drums he meant, the man tapped the ground with his cane 3 times, and the sound echoed back from somewhere far below. Through the 1940s and 50s, the war stories turned into folklore of sound. Radio operators stationed near the ridge during Woo reported low-frequency interference that pulsed like heartbeats. A local farmer named Patrick Hooper, interviewed in 1949, described hearing whispering through his tractor's metal frame when he plowed near an old embankment. He said it spoke like rain on tin, scattered words repeating in rhythm, 4 down, 4 below, 4 still. No one else heard it. The next decade brought tourists, hikers, and amateur explorers. They came with cameras and flashlights, chasing stories of lost soldiers and underground rivers. Some returned with photographs, pale streaks of light hovering behind them. Faces that blurred, though the rest of the image stayed sharp. One explorer's journal, found later in an abandoned car near Luray, ends with a single sentence written in haste. There were voices ahead of us, but no footprints. As the 20th century aged, the myths kept breathing, taking new shapes. Truckers driving the valley highways at night spoke of lights flickering beneath the road. Hikers heard music underground, not melody, but rhythm, steady and hollow, like marching boots through stone. Archaeologists from a nearby college conducted a small dig in the 1970s and reported discovering strange mineral burns in circular patterns on the cave walls, not caused by flame, not by tool, but by prolonged heat of unknown origin. One of them, in a later interview, confessed, "It wasn't the marks that frightened me. It was that the rock still felt warm." Even now, modern visitors to the Shenandoah National Park say the valley feels alive. Rangers describe losing signal near the old caves. Cameras fog at random. Phones record faint background murmurs when left on the ground. The recordings, when amplified, reveal rhythm soft, even like breath. Acousticians blame wind resonance, barometric fluctuation, rock compression. The locals just nod. They've heard it all their lives. To them, the valley is a body that remembers a lung that inhales history and exhales myth. They still leave small offerings where the stone cracks open. Tobacco silver coins, a strip of blue cloth. Old families teach their children to never whistle underground, to never answer a voice that sounds too much like their own. And when the fog lies low over Fisher's Hill and the snow softens every sound, they say, the dwellers move again, brushing against the thin wall between past and present. No one calls them ghosts. No one calls them soldiers. They are simply the dwellers, the ones who stayed beneath the war and waited for the world above to forget them. And if you stand at night on the frozen fields where the Shenandoah runs slow and black, you might still hear what the valley kept. A breath through the soil steady as time, and the faintest voice rising through the frost. A whisper that sounds like a name, or maybe just the earth. Remembering. What happened in Shenandoah did not stay in Shenandoah. The valley's breath, the silence underfoot. It traveled, carried by men who left the war and took its echoes with them. Every conflict leaves behind the same residue sound that doesn't fade, footsteps that don't belong to anyone still alive. And in every war since, soldiers have described the same thing. The same silence that watches back. Letters from France in 1916 speak of tunnels under Verdun that seem to listen. British sappers digging near Beaumont Hamel wrote that their picks struck something hollow. Not stone, not air. Something in between. They described hearing tapping in reply, measured deliberate intelligent. One lieutenant insisted he heard words. Not in English, not in French, he said, but in a rhythm that almost made sense. The report vanished after the war, but fragments survived in diaries. The ground speaks. Do not answer it. In 1917, during the battles beneath Messines Ridge, miners detonated 19 vast charges beneath German lines, explosions so powerful they were felt in London. For months afterward, men in nearby trenches reported hearing low rumbles at night, not aftershocks, not artillery. Something slower, softer, like the sound of an ocean below the soil. Geologists blamed trapped air subsidence, but the soldiers started calling it the breathing earth. The same words their grandfathers had used in the Shenandoah Valley. Across the world, in the limestone fields of the Pacific Marines in the 1940s, told stories of voices coming from caves before they entered them. In New Guinea, men swore they heard the dead calling by name from tunnels choked with vines. In the Philippines, patrols vanished into caverns used as supply depots. When rescue parties went in, they found rations, intact rifles stacked neatly, but no bodies. Only their lanterns burned down to ash, as if the men had stood and watched them die out. In Europe again, the same pattern returned. At Monte Cassino at the Siegfried Line, in the ruined cellars of Warsaw, soldiers spoke of hearing knocks that followed them through the stone. Sometimes the knocks matched their heartbeats. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they continued long after the men stopped moving. In 1952, during the Korean War, a platoon of U.S. engineers reported acoustic anomalies in the mountains north of Haeju, vibrations recorded on seismic sensors, rhythmic and regular, but with no source. They thought it was enemy tunneling. But no tunnels were found. The pattern repeated every night for a week, between 3 and 4 a.m. Always the same frequency, as if something beneath was pulsing, alive. The recordings still exist, archived, unlabeled, filed under miscellaneous field data. Listen closely and you can hear it: 3 slow pulses, silence, then 3 again. The same pattern recorded decades later in Virginia's limestone caverns. War moves forward. Technology changes. But the rhythm beneath it doesn't. In Vietnam, soldiers called it the jungle hum. The faint vibration that seemed to come from under the ground even when the trees were still. Radio operators near the Shenandoah Valley reported interference that formed repeating phrases in Morse, impossible sequences that translated to nothing, or to names from unit rosters weeks before they died. Engineers blamed humidity. The veterans blamed the earth. They said the hills were listening. In Afghanistan, troops stationed near old Soviet bunkers described echoes underground, like wind in pipes, except the air was still. The interpreters said the locals refused to build on that land, calling it the place that eats sound. When asked why, an old shepherd answered, because it remembers too much, again and again across languages, uniforms, flags. The stories converge, always underground. Always after battle, always the same sense that something remains beneath the soil, awake, waiting. Maybe it's the pressure of memory itself, sound waves trapped in rock, bouncing endlessly through time. Or maybe it's something older, feeding on memory like heat stored in stone. Historians call it convergence folklore, recurring myth, born from shared trauma. But soldiers who've walked those grounds use simpler words. They call it the underwar. A war that never ends, fought not in sky or field, but in the dark beneath, where men go to hide from dying and find something that never died at all. Even the language of the reports mirrors itself. Unexplained vibration, voices beneath, light movement underground. Different decades, same handwriting, same phrasing. As though the story rewrites itself, each generation changing names, but keeping rhythm. One photograph from 1944, taken in Italy, shows a tunnel collapse. In the background, through the dust, a pale figure stands upright, unmoving, blurred beyond scale. The negative was reviewed, verified, no double exposure, no light leak. When shown to veterans years later, one said quietly, "We saw him too, but we thought it was one of ours." Another whispered, "He had no face." So maybe Shenandoah was never just one place. Maybe it was the first time the earth tried to tell us what it holds. Every war since has dug deeper trenches, tunnels, bunkers, catacombs. Every war has heard the same hum. And when the fighting stops, the ground remains restless, as if waiting for the next generation to knock again. Because that's what the pattern suggests, a call and answer. A dialogue between the living and whatever listens beneath. And when the wind passes through those caverns, from Virginia to Verdun to the jungles of Indochina, it carries that same breath. Steady, ancient, unfinished. Some call it coincidence. Some call it myth. But for those who felt it under their boots, that low pulse through the soil, there's no mistaking it for anything human. The soldiers who wrote of the dwellers may have been the first to name them, but they were not the last to hear them. Every battlefield that sinks into silence becomes their cathedral. And every man who walks away takes a piece of that silence with him, a hum that follows faint rhythmic as though the ground itself is whispering a memory too old for words. And maybe if you listen carefully on a night when the world feels still, you'll hear it too. The same sound that echoed in Shenandoah in the winter of 1863. A slow, measured breathing beneath the frost. A promise that the earth never forgets what it has eaten. The first real attempt to rediscover the Shenandoah caves came not from historians, but from the military itself. In 1978, the U.S. Geological Survey launched a small survey team to remap old limestone systems along the valley floor, officially to check for groundwater channels that might threaten new construction. Unofficially, the coordinates traced back to the same site number 4, marked in Civil War field reports. The team went in with modern equipment, seismic sensors, carbon dioxide meters, ground-penetrating radar. They expected data. They found something else. Their report, declassified decades later, is clinical at first. Numbers, measurements, topography. But halfway through, the tone shifts. Readings inconsistent with normal limestone density. Subterranean cavities exhibit periodic fluctuations, duration consistent with biological respiration. Then one single phrase typed in all caps, audible anomaly detected. They'd heard something. 3 rhythmic pulses followed by silence, then 3 again. It repeated every 47 seconds. The same pattern recorded in the Korean sensors 20 years before. They assumed it was equipment feedback. Until the vibration began to sync with their own speech stopping, when they stopped returning only when they whispered. The recording was sent to Washington, analyzed by acoustic experts, filed under environmental resonance unverified. The report's appendix includes a transcription of a conversation from that night caught by accident on a field recorder. A woman's voice says, "Do you hear that?" A man answers, "Yeah." Pause. Then the woman again, softer. "It sounds like breathing." After that, the audio ends in static. The project was quietly shelved. But in the following years, small fragments resurfaced. Scientists who left the agency anonymous letters sent to local papers. One claiming the tunnels under Fisher's Hill extended much deeper than maps showed. One letter in particular, signed only H.W., described a chamber lined with glass fused into the rock, as if fire had burned from the inside out. The letter ended, "I don't think it was made by us." In 1984, a university archaeology team tried again, not to dig, but to listen. They lowered a long-range microphone into a narrow fissure near the valley's northern ridge. For hours, they recorded only static, the sound of stone air distance. Then near midnight, a faint clicking began. 3 beats. Pause, 3 again. When they amplified it, they found harmonics frequencies too low for the human ear, too deliberate for coincidence. It was a voice, they thought. Or several layered in rhythm, like chant or machinery. The file was never published. But one of the students years later told a friend what she remembered. It wasn't what scared us. It was that it stopped exactly when we spoke. Rumors returned to the valley. Fishermen along the river claimed they heard murmurs rising through the ice on cold mornings. Hikers reported tremors that didn't register on seismographs. Dogs refused to approach certain ravines. And when local spelunkers mapped a newly opened cave in 1992, their footage captured something strange. A pattern of concentric circles burned into the limestone, smooth as mirrors, radiating from a single point like ripples frozen in time. The cave was sealed 2 weeks later after one of the explorers went missing. His camera was found. The final frame shows a streak of light bending in mid-air, not from the lantern, not from reflection. It bends toward the ground like a line being pulled taut. By the early 2000s, the valley had become a magnet for the strange ghost hunters, researchers, conspiracy theorists. Everyone wanted to find the breathing caves. Most found nothing but silence. But silence in Shenandoah is never empty. In 2003, a park ranger named Daniel Keller reported hearing a steady low exhalation while marking a hiking trail near Fisher's Hill. He described it as wind without direction, like air being drawn in and pushed out by the mountain itself. He laughed about it later, until his recording equipment left overnight on the ridge captured the same rhythm from PFC. Lake's 1863 surgeon log, 3 slow pulses, silence 3 again. Keller quit 6 months later. He moved out of the valley. He never spoke publicly about it, but his brother kept his field notes. On the final page, written in shaking hand, "They're not gone. They're waiting for the war to return." The Smithsonian once planned a controlled excavation in 2009. Funding collapsed. Locals said the ground shook for a week after the surveyors left. No earthquake was recorded, but water in nearby wells turned brown, thick metallic, like something disturbed deep below had bled into it. Old families along the ridge refused to drink from their wells for a generation after that. And yet, the story refuses to stay buried. Satellite imaging in 2015 revealed irregular thermal signatures beneath Fisher's Hill, not geological heat, but something rhythmic, cyclical. Scientists dismissed it as an anomaly in data calibration. But the images showed concentric waves of warmth moving through stone like the pulse of a living thing. One analyst said, "If it's error, it's the most consistent one I've ever seen." There are stories now that sound like the old ones. Campers waking to find their tents covered in a thin layer of ash. Photographs showing lanterns glowing inside sealed cave mouths. Hikers hearing their own voices repeating seconds after they speak, but lower, slower, and closer to the ground. One teenager recorded what he thought were bats. The playback revealed faint whispers repeating the phrase down here. The scientists explain it condensation sound, reflection pareidolia. They always explain it, and yet the pattern continues. Every 50 years someone goes back into the earth, and the earth answers. Every time the same rhythm, every time the same silence after. If you walk Fisher's Hill at night, you can still feel it, the soft vibration under your boots, steady patient. Locals say it's nothing more than trapped groundwater. But sometimes, when the fog curls low and the wind dies, you can hear the valley draw a single deep breath. It exhales through the soil, slow, human, almost tender. And somewhere beneath, if you listen long enough, another breath follows, perfectly in time. The dwellers, the old ones, said never died. They simply changed from men of flesh to men of sound. Bound to the stone, they sought to escape. Each generation disturbs them, waking memory like a heartbeat long buried. And the more the world forgets the war, the louder they begin to stir. In 2021, when night vision drones surveyed the valley for erosion control, the footage briefly captured a faint illumination inside a sealed cave mouth. Frame by frame, it flickered once, twice, 3 times. Then nothing. When the drone's light passed back over it, the cave was empty. But the sound in the recording filtered, amplified, cleaned of interference, revealed something unmistakable. A chorus of faint human breaths, layered and uneven, blending with the sound of stone shifting. At the very end, a voice not loud, but certain, whispering 2 words. "Still here." The official report concludes, "No anomaly detected." But those who've heard the unedited tape say otherwise. They say the valley is not dead. They say the caves have begun to breathe again, and that the sound is getting louder. Morning arrives in the Shenandoah, the way a memory returns slowly, reluctantly, half forgotten. The fog doesn't lift. It drifts curling over the fields like something alive. The sun bleeds through the haze gold, over gray, washing the frost off the fence rails that have stood since the war. Every sound feels older here. The crow of a rooster, the creak of wood, the drip of meltwater slipping down limestone cracks. Even the river seems to move with caution, as though remembering what it once carried. This valley has learned how to disguise its scars. The trenches have softened into shallow ditches, swallowed by grass. The old gun emplacements now bloom with wildflowers. The past doesn't vanish here. It simply changes its shape, waiting under new names, new routes. But when you walk alone before dawn, and your breath hangs pale in the air, it's hard to believe the war ever left. The silence feels heavier than peace. It feels watchful. Locals rise early, as they always have. They don't talk much about what lies under the ridge, not anymore. They work their fields, fix their fences, check the traps before the sun climbs high. But if you ask quietly, they'll tell you small things, how the ground hums before a storm, how the wells sometimes tremble, how sound seems to travel farther underground than above. They'll say the soil here has a voice of its own. And they'll tell you, if they trust you, that sometimes they still hear the old rhythm, 3 pulses a pause, 3 again coming through the floorboards on winter nights. Some have tried to explain it. Geologists talk about air pockets, shifting stone resonance between caverns. Scientists mention pressure waves, micro-tremors, low-frequency acoustics. Every explanation sounds right until the moment you hear it yourself. Then something changes. The rational world shrinks. The sound isn't under you anymore. It's inside you, matching your breath, slowing your heartbeat, whispering to your bones. People still visit Fisher's Hill. Students, historians, curious travelers who read about the missing patrols and come searching for the story beneath the story. They walk the same ridges, stand at the same sinkholes, listening to the wind moving through the trees. But the wind in Shenandoah doesn't sound like other places. It carries a tone low, steady, almost human. It vibrates through the soles of your boots. It hums in your ribs. Some call it the echo of the war. Others say it's the breath of the dwellers. A few bring instruments, recorders, infrared cameras, electromagnetic sensors, hoping to catch proof that the valley still remembers. Most return with nothing but static, a blank reel of white noise. But sometimes when the playback is slowed, a shape emerges in the hiss, a rhythm too regular to be chance. A faint whisper that seems to form the outline of words. One researcher claimed it said, "below." Another heard, "still here." None of them went back. In the old towns, Strasbourg, Woodstock, Front Royal, you can still find people who remember the war without ever having lived it. It lingers in their stories, passed down like weather patterns. A farmer tells you his grandfather saw blue uniforms glimmering through fog in 1901. A woman at a diner swears her father once found footprints in frozen mud that led to a rock face and stopped. A park ranger recalls walking a trail at dusk and hearing boots marching behind him, stopping when he stopped, starting when he started. He looked back. No one was there. They all describe it the same way, not frightening, not even unnatural, just inevitable, like a part of the land's rhythm, a reminder that something underneath never stopped moving. The archives hold more than papers now. Audio tapes, video fragments, thermal scans, stacked in boxes that no one opens anymore. A few files are missing, a name scratched off a manifest, a logbook page torn away. Some say the government sealed the last accessible caves in 2018. Others whisper that someone still goes in quietly without lights, listening for the pulse. The truth doesn't matter. What matters is that the valley hasn't gone silent. It waits. And if you stand there long enough in the deep fog of winter morning, you'll understand why the people of Shenandoah don't speak loudly. Why their children grow up knowing that sound travels farther than words. Why they close their doors early when the wind dies. Because silence here isn't absence, it's presence. It fills the space between heartbeats. It lingers behind every echo. It listens back. Maybe that's all the dwellers ever were, not monsters, not spirits, but memory made solid. The echo of survival itself. The part of humanity that refuses to let the past go quiet. Every battle carves one deeper into the earth. Every generation adds another layer to the hum. We dig our shelters, we hide from war, we call it safety. But the ground keeps its own count. It remembers the sound of fear. It remembers the sound of men whispering in the dark, praying not to be found. And maybe after enough time, that sound begins to whisper back. If you walk the valley tonight, listen carefully. The river will sound like breathing. The trees will sway, slow, heavy, like something thinking beneath the roots. Somewhere a dog will bark once and fall silent, and the whole land will pause with it. In that pause, if you hold your breath, you might feel it. A slow rhythm, patient and endless, pulsing through the soil. It isn't the wind, it isn't the water. It's older than both, older than war, older than memory. What if the dwellers aren't waiting for us to find them? What if they're waiting for us to listen? And what if all this time it was never them trapped below, but us trapped above, hearing only half of what the earth is trying to say? The story of Shenandoah doesn't end. It just grows quieter, folding itself back into fog and frost. The lanterns of 1863 burn again in reflection, their light rippling across the walls of unseen caverns. Men still walk there, somewhere between history and rumor, following echoes down corridors that bend into darkness. Their footsteps merge with the hum. Their names fade into stone, and the valley breathes. What if the valley isn't haunted? What if it's awake? The wind picks up. The frame drifts toward the tree line. A distant rumble rolls beneath the hills, faint, rhythmic, like the turning of lungs beneath the earth. Then silence. One last breath, and the screen fades to black.